Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Trong, and I'm the Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum here in Los Angeles. On behalf of the board and staff, I warmly welcome the panelists and all of the attendees to this discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to read a statement which acknowledges the original stewards of the land our museum resides on. The Chinese American Museum acknowledges that this virtual event is taking place across the continent of North America, also known as Turtle Island, original and unseceded territories of hundreds of sovereign indigenous people and nations. We acknowledge and honor the original caretakers of the various places our speakers are joining us from. Today, I'm joining you from downtown Los Angeles in the facilities of the Chinese American Museum, physically located on the historic village of Yangna in the Tovagna, unceded territories of the Gabalino, Shoshone, Quiche, and Tongva indigenous peoples of these lands. To this day, there are at least 7 tribes of the Gabalino people who maintain an ongoing presence, power, and relations amongst their people, their natural relations, and the lands they belong to. I invite you to remember the indigenous people who affirm their sovereignty and ongoing relations with the lands you currently occupy, and ask yourself, how do you, your people, or your organization honor these relatives? Thank you for serving this land acknowledgement with me. Before we begin our program, here are some things that you may need to know. The program is being recorded and be made for public and for viewing in the future. At the end of the program, we'll take a group photo. At this point, a CAN staff member will provide instructions to turn on your video to those who wish to participate. The chat box is currently unavailable. However, if you do need assistance, you may still send a private chat to the host Chinese American Museum. Today is the day 7 of 8 days of commemorative programming for the 150th anniversary of the Chinese Massacre of 1871. We are pleased to continue our partnership with Artists at Play, a Los Angeles-based theater collective that tells the stories of Asian American experience. Through their main stage production, new plays development, and other events, Artists at Play advocates for and collaborates with diverse communities of artists. Last year, we presented together a scene of the Chinese Lady. This year, to commemorate the 150th anniversary, we continue the partnership to present excerpts of the Chinese Massacre annotated, written by Tom Jacobson and directed by Jeff Liu. Today's program is a post-production discussion to learn more about Artists at Play and how they work to tell our community stories through the performing arts. Before we begin the discussion, I'd like to present a short clip of Chinese Massacre annotated.
Our business prospers because I welcome Americans to our store, treat them well, make myself part of the community deliberately, slowly. But I am not foolish enough to think myself one of them.
You have their education, their religion.
My Christian education did not make me Christian.
I'll become a Christian and leave Chinese superstition behind.
Leave! You've been in Gold Mountain 1 month. You have no idea of American superstition, especially about us. I promised our mother that I would take care of you.
And you do.
Tong Yu, Jean's wife, brings in some containers.
Tong Yu, congratulate my brother. He's just been married in a romantic American legal proceeding.
That fast? Barbaric. To whom?
Yat Ho.
She's a bad girl.
She's my wife.
Yeah, it's not her fault, but she's a bad girl.
Chi, your wife is disrespectful.
You would do well to listen to her. Tong Yu is always right.
Unfortunately. Whatever has happened to her, you must honor her now. Be kind to her. Her life has been hard.
How do you know?
My brother even has some money to start his new family.
From?
Yo Heng. I know he's Hakka.
Hakka! Bunde makes no difference to me. But Hong Chao is a bad company and Yo Hing's an evil man. Last year, his men were arrested for tying some poor woman to a stake, whipping and beating her. Now he's out for revenge on everyone who informed on them.
My brother is also converting to Christianity.
It's the American thing to do. You talk about America all the time. You talk me into coming here. Escape the restrictions of China. Become a new man in Los Angeles like you did. Where no one reminds you of tradition, your place.
No, become a new man, a respected man like your brother, but not a fool.
where people come from all over the world.
But strange ideas.
New ideas. Freedom. Clean paper. Fresh ink to write with.
In all different languages. Nobody understands anybody. In China, everyone understands.
Here you can have any religion you want. Huh? It's what you say.
You're truly converting?
Perhaps.
Then you must learn to turn the other cheek.
What's that?
It's Christian. When someone does this, you turn your other cheek so they can do it again. Now that's what an American would do. Not what a Christian would do.
Thank you. A longer version can be found in a link in the chat box. Please note that the play reading contains adult materials, including harsh language, racial slurs, and graphic violence. The video is available now until midnight, October 24th. I'd now like to take this opportunity to introduce Stephanie Lau, our moderator for the program. Stephanie is an arts administrator with more than 20 years of experience in the Los Angeles theater. She's a co-founder and producing artistic leader of Artists at Play, which she produced main stage shows, new play developments, fundraisers, and other special events. Stephanie has been involved with Code Tofu Improv since 2003 and sits on the national board of the Consortium of Asian American Theaters and Artists. Stephanie, thank you for joining us and for your leadership and continued partnership with CAM.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a co-founder and co-producing artistic leader of Artists at Play. This year, we celebrate our 10th anniversary of creating and supporting theatrical work that explores the diverse experiences of the Asian American community. Thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss the play, The Chinese Massacre Annotated. Today's panel includes Tom Jacobson, a Los Angeles-based playwright who has had more than 100 productions of his plays produced throughout the country and internationally. He's also the president of the Greater Los Angeles Zoo Association. Jeff Liu is a director for theater, film, and the web. He has made films of 2 David Henry Hwang plays, Yellowface and Trying to Find Chinatown. And finally, Julie Lee is an actor, director, and artistic director of Cold Tofu, the nation's first and longest running Asian American improv and sketch comedy troupe. She was in the world premiere of The Chinese Massacre Annotated in 2011 at Circle X Theater Company and reprises her roles in the Artists at Play online reading. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this panel. It was really great to revisit The Chinese Massacre Annotated. I saw it, 10 years ago at Circle X Theater, and I remember being just really blown away by the complexity of the story, the history, all the characters. And I think, like so many people, I grew up in Los Angeles. I am deeply involved in the Asian American community in Los Angeles, but I knew so little about what happened on October 24th, 1871. And so to see it, on stage, and to learn the kind of very complex history and intersecting histories of the Los Angeles residents at that time that led to what happened was, it was amazing and entertaining and educational and it was just so much. And I think one really interesting that, Tom, you wrote a play about this. So why did you write a play about the Chinese Massacre of 1871? And then related to that, why did you not use completely fictional characters? Why choose to integrate so many real people who lived and died during that time, like Jean Tong, Yut Ho, Biddy Mason, rather than using fictional characters?
So in the early 2000s, there was a program to commission plays about California history. Circle X Theater Company applied to that program in the state of California, and they wanted me to submit a project. And so they said, write a play about California or Los Angeles history. And I happened to work at the time at the LA County Museum of Natural History, which has a very important archive of Los Angeles history. So I went to the curator and I said, give me some stories of LA history, but not the ones that most people think of. So nothing Hollywood, nothing 20th century. I wanted a 19th century or earlier story. And he gave me 20 of them. And there are some amazing stories, many of those stories still untold in the popular idiom. And so I took a selection to Circle X and I said, which one of these would you like me to do? I'm interested in any of these. And they picked the Chinese Massacre. And I said, are you sure? Because they're a wonderful theater company, but at the time they had one Asian American company member. And they said, yes, we're sure, because we need to grow and we need to change. And by doing this story, we'll have that opportunity. So I wrote the play and I researched the play. And of course, as you were saying, I learned all kinds of things I didn't know about this terrible, but very, very interesting story of Los Angeles history. And in answering your other question about why did I choose the real people? Well, first of all, now it's 150 years ago. So I wouldn't be probably upsetting any families that whose families were talked about, or at least less likely. And the part of the premise of the play is that it's playing with the notion of what is truth and what is history. And so by using the real people and the real names and telling the truth mostly, but also calling into question what is truth and what is history. And the play deliberately has some lies in it. And it identifies the lies, or it questions a conventional truth. One of the things that was interesting in the research, there was a document written in 1962 that described the Chinese Massacre, and it was considered for many, many years the most accurate source on what happened. And in researching it, I discovered that it had a big error in it, that the couple that got married, whose marriage sort of sparked the massacre on October 24th, they were not married in October, they were married in March. And it was a different couple in October. So the play calls that out too, and it helps us question the idea of history and who writes history, who records history, and who remembers history. And history can change, as we see frequently.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting point that I think brings us forward to Jeff, is that how do you then, when you directed, Jeff, this play in 2011 for Circle X, how do you balance that history and those kind of falsehoods that are based on that history, as a show that's meant to entertain and educate, and also then a play that is so big? That was one thing that when we were working to figure out how to present the play as a reading, there's like 30 something characters played by
42.
I'm sorry, 42 characters played by, what did we say, 14 actors? 14 actors. It's a big play on stage. And then and there was a challenge to figure out what's the story that we want to distill for the Zoom reading. So when you were doing, both versions, let's say on stage and Zoom, what were then those challenges? But then also, what were the joys? What did you love to be able to do on stage and on video?
Yeah, well, I have to pay a lot of tribute to Tom for tackling this. And if you know Tom, he's got the kind of mind that's actually turned on by these kinds of things, and then also to Circle X, because doing a world premiere of a new work with 14 actors, is no small task. And then, as you were saying, Tom's world is very complex. On the one hand, I wanted to feel a little bit like a thriller, an action thriller, right? Because this was a rough time, it's a rough event. How do we bring that kind of physicality and brutality to it, to give you some little idea of what that was. And one of the things was, I think we've got to figure out how to stage a lynching right in front of the audience live. And I have to pay tribute to friends of ours too, Diana Lee Inosanto and Ron Bulicki, who are of course martial arts royalty, but also have the stunt people's skills to help us create that rigging. Right. So that's one thing, is how does it have the pace to feel like that kind of story? And on the other hand, he has this whole meta play going on, right? Questioning what is history, what is not, the annotation. Are you getting too caught up in emotions, or are you using your head to question what you know, but also question what the play is doing, right? And so it was a matter of fitting those together with the right pacing, and then of course the level of ensemble acting as well to pull it off so that the story would be clear and then land emotionally with the audience, right? And if you read the play, which I believe is published, Tom can tell Morris about that again.
It's published. It's really hard to read.
Oh, yeah, and there's a lot of stuff that's deliberately overlapping. Okay, I did a little bit of it for Zoom because I thought, no, if we really do that all throughout, it'll just be too annoying. But, you know, different conversations happening at different times, that's intentional on his part. How do you get that feel, but also have the clarity of the story, right? The other thing is, again, having the gift of 14 actors is part of what this is about, is a mob. And well, if you only have 2 or 3 people plus sound cues, that's one way to do it. But boy, having those bodies together and surrounding and interacting and also representing. One of the things I loved about the play when I read it too was that even back then, when LA was only under 6,000 in population, far less important than San Francisco at the time, it was already multicultural, racially, accent-wise, European immigrants from different places. And he had the vision to attempt all of that. And then we had to put together a company to try and do justice to that. So all of that, I think, was joyful. You know, I have very fond memories of that company. And the funny thing of doing it here is we got to reunite at least some of the cast from 10 years ago. So on the one hand, it was a reunion, you know, personal reunion of us going, wow, we're still here in LA and telling stories. And, you know, whether we've seen each other in those 10 years, we're still friends. We still belong to this storytelling community, people who believe that stories are important. And then given this anniversary, it's also a way of us, I think, paying a little bit of tribute to those people and those events. And in figuring out what parts to do was a challenge, as Stephanie knows. We had a lot of conversations, but Tom actually gave us this idea of, well, you kind of need the beginning to establish the annotations, and then you kind of need the end of the acts for the action, but the family, focusing on the family, that was what I ran with. And it was like, if we can just, we only do an excerpt, but we can just give a little picture of what life might have been like for these Chinese immigrants in that time in America, in LA, right, with that perspective of 1871, 2021, then maybe that's something that could be alive in about 50 minutes. So that's what we tried to do.
Yeah, it was really challenging. I mean, I read the script again and I was like, wow, because to read the layers and all the characters, and I had forgotten how deep everything got in terms of every character had their own struggles and relationship, right? I mean, even all the ensemble members, you could see how everything was interconnected and how the relationships and the different tensions that existed. You know, it's the Chinese Massacre annotated, and you know, the focus is on, you know, the story that kind of the thread is, you know, what happens between Lee and Curly, or Lee and the Reverend. But there was just so much depth in every character. You know, no one was just there as a throwaway. You know, they really added to the rich fabric of what LA was during that time. So then related to that, Julie, you were born in LA, you grew up here. What did you know about the Chinese Massacre of 1871? What was your experience going through learning about everything, and at the same time, portraying these characters, annotating the story on stage?
Yeah, well, prior to doing this play, what I knew about the Chinese Massacre was absolutely nothing. I'd never heard of it. I didn't know that anything like this could have even happened here. Um, so yeah, I didn't learn anything about this, never heard of it. And it really made me think about my education. I went to school in La Crescenta in elementary school and then La Cañada for high school. And you don't learn about any of this stuff. Our education is so sanitized. So that's one, answering the first part of your question. Approaching this material as an actor, um, well, I think it's just reliving history. I think for actors, we are really just emphasizing, like that's what we do professionally. But I think we're all capable, we have the capacity for that. And I think we all do that. So I don't think I approach this material any differently than I would have prior to being an actor. The trauma of those events. And when I read the play, I did not understand any of it. It was very complicated. The script is very complicated. A lot of things happening. I read it twice, still didn't know what this was really about before we started rehearsal. But then, from doing the play and trying to glean the information, you start Googling the Chinese Massacre, right? Like, what's the surrounding thing? And there were so many massacres throughout history that we don't ever learn about or hear about. And what's special about this play is that it really puts a spotlight on history and what's been cataloged and archived, for future generations, and really calling that into question. There were a lot of quotes within the play from newspaper clippings and things like that. Yeah. So pitting that up against real life human experiences through the actors was really fascinating, because I don't know that in our education we perceive history in that way. We kind of take it as fact, period, and then take the test and then see what grade you get on it. Wow.
Yeah. So, this last 2 years of the pandemic, it's been, many institutions have faced a racial reckoning, right? Police, theaters, city governments, all of that, right? Arts institutions all across, we've been faced with needing to examine and address the institutionalized racism and discrimination that people have historically experienced in the United States, primarily Black and Indigenous communities, but generally all communities of color. So considering the context that we exist in now, what is the relevance of a play like the Chinese Massacre annotated? 10 years since its writing, but also in this current environment, 150th anniversary of the massacre, everything that's been going on. Julie, yes.
Yeah, well, in addition to everything that I learned, from doing this play 10 years ago, I just realized we were in a time when we weren't doing land acknowledgements when we first did this play. So to view this play, during this time, with the land acknowledgement that Michael gave prior to even this web panel, it just reframed history once again. I mean, it's just constant reframing.
One of the things that's cool about any artwork, but I think it even is more true of theater, because you do a new production, if you do it again, it means something different. I wrote a play in 1989 called Tainted Blood about Oscar Wilde and vampires, and it was an AIDS play, and everyone instantly perceived it as an AIDS play. When it was done here in Los Angeles in 1998, no one perceived it as an AIDS play, because there were the antiretrovirals. So things change. And this play in particular, the things that are cited in the play, including the other LA race riots of 1943, 1965 and 1992, a lot has happened in the last 10 years and in the last 2 years, as you were saying, Stephanie. And it means something different. But the section in the play about the Los Angeles police force and how corrupt it was, that has special meaning after the last 2 years.
I mean, there was a quote in the play, as quoted from an article, saying that at that time in 1871, the police force wanted to, have a thorough cleansing of their force back then. And you think of LAPD now, well.
For me, I talked about this a little bit before. The sort of racial intersectionality that was already there was really important to me to capture. And then here, I feel it even more. As I was paring down, I was like, no, but we still have to keep that feeling, that annotators. Why is it so important that we have an African-American person, a Latino person in LA, and then the perspective on what lynching is and isn't, right? For me, it's a perspective on just the heart of Asian American identity itself, because in so many ways we are and continue to be the sort of the in-between people, right? The non-Black or brown, but still POCs, right? So on the one hand, there are privileges that, right? That even aspiration towards a certain level of model minority or white adjacency, if we want to call it that. But then you also have to buy into, you're a bit of a pawn as well in these other deep racial struggles that are going on, which are part of the DNA of this country. And then on the other hand, you have to ask the question, which is thrown into even greater relief by the pandemic and also the events of the last 4 years, right? Is, well, where do we or each of us want to stand in there, right? Because America tells a lot of stories about itself. And it turns out that one of the greatest things that we or any culture does is just straight up denial, right? Which is almost more dangerous than malice. Not really, but I'm going to say almost, since we're in this sort of metaphoric world. And so part of why we tell stories is to ask ourselves that question. And I think this piece now, 10 years later from then, but now for me raises all those questions that I think our community and America itself has to be asking. Who are we really? Where do we want to stand on this? And what is truth to us, right? Not just to history, and people can fight over that, and then what does it mean about who we are as a community? And I think that's again, narratives are important to everyone, but especially in these in-between communities. I think that's something that is very interesting to us in particular as Asian.
So Jeff, as kind of maybe a tangent off of that question, especially I think among the Asian American community, there is a really big importance on the, hashtag representation matters, right? So in your view, is that enough? Or does it have to have that contextualized experience in history in order to really make it mean something? Because you bring up the kind of in-between space, right? And especially I think the work that you do film work, and you're currently working with Center Theater Group on a project. How much more is it than just being represented? Or is that enough?
Well, representation matters. There's no question. We've seen that, where if you never get to see yourself, that's as a POC, or if you never get to see women in certain kinds of roles with certain kinds of agency, that affects how you dream. It affects how you think what is even possible for me, or anyone else. One of my favorite quotes is when I think the first Black female astronaut was talking about how the character of Uhura is partly who inspired her. It was like, there you go, right? Or Sulu, right? For us, if you want to, nerd out in that way. So yes, representation matters. Is it enough? Personally, I don't think so, because, right, here's representation. Really, really looking at what is taught, what isn't taught, what is systemic, what do we not even question. That requires a deeper level, I think, of critical thinking. It's not knee-jerk. It's, what does it mean to be an educated, engaged citizen now in what is supposed to be a democracy, right? It really depends on each citizen taking that responsibility and go, well, okay, what have I been taught? What are they saying? What are they saying? What do I believe? And then how does that affect my actions as a citizen? So partly that raises up arts and representation, and why there have to be sort of three-dimensional representations of all peoples and a basic kind of dignity and respect, right? But I think it can go beyond that. It's about, well, how deep do you want to go? What does it mean to be American? What does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to be a human being? What are the responsibilities if you live in a country this rich and powerful? Okay, we're not just innocent. I think there's a tendency to go, well, this is my life. I'm not responsible for anything that went before. And it turns out, well, if you want to talk about systemic, if you want to talk about privilege, that's all of us at different levels. And representation alone doesn't give that level of understanding, does it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really been a balance, right? And how far, and the idea that not everything needs to fulfill that mission or that job or that goal, right? And I think that's been really the challenge of, like, for us at Artists at Play, the work that we do, how much of it is just about seeing Asian Americans on stage versus how much of it is really what responsibility do we have to educate and really push an anti-racist or anti-biased, work and art, so then related to that, Tom, a lot of your work, you write a lot about Los Angeles. I mean, I think one of the first things that, when I had first learned about you was that you're like the Los Angeles playwright. Like, you explore a lot of Los Angeles history. I think Julie had been in a previous show, right? Julie, with Rogue, I think that was
Yes.
about.
Yes,
Right?
it
Yeah.
was called Mexican Day, and Tom was a playwright and Jeff was the director.
Right. Tom, what is your kind of interest in covering LA history in that way through art, and then I think related to that is, what role then does your art, or do you feel that responsibility for your art to unearth and educate about Los Angeles?
Well, I love that question. One of the things that you touched on was the thought, we talked about community, and all four of us are in the Los Angeles theater community together. And that is one of the joys of my life, is being in community with people I've worked with and want to work with again. So, when I'd worked with Jeff and I'd worked with Julie, Julie's kind of my muse. I always think of Julie when I'm writing a play. And so I was really happy to work with the two of them on Mexican Day, which is about Los Angeles history. In fact, it's about Los Angeles history, hyper-local history. It's a block from my house that Bimini Baths existed for 50 years until Julie, in the guise of Hisai Yamamoto, integrated this racially exclusive bathing facility. So I like, obviously Los Angeles is very rich with stories and untold stories. And if I want to write about topics such as race, especially, it is a way for me as a white playwright to explore something that is part of my life because it is local. So this is my community. These are my friends, and I live here. And so, and it's very legitimate to call into question whether I should have written the Chinese Massacre annotated, what authority I have to have done that. my authority in a lot of my plays is simply that I live here and I'm part of this community that we're in Los Angeles. But there's just so much to explore here, and I love doing that, and I love doing that with my theater friends.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think because also professionally, you used to work at the Natural History Museum. You're currently the president of the Greater Los Angeles Zoo Association. So I think when we first logged onto the Zoom, this was the first time I met you actually, but I'd been an admirer of your work for so long, particularly because your work focuses and really explores Los Angeles, which I think is greatly needed. Especially because we in the Los Angeles theater community kind of work with the stigma, right? That Los Angeles theater's not good. We're just here because of Hollywood, and really, New York is where theater is. So I've really appreciated having the opportunity to kind of explore and see your work and the way different histories and stories about Los Angeles are unearthed, then through the productions of your work. So I really appreciate that.
I do too, Tom. Question.
Okay, so there is a question in the chat. There's I don't know if everyone can see it, but generally it's asking regarding what Jeff Liu speaks of in representation and diversity being a citizen. 2 years ago, at a BLM event, 2 Black leaders talked about the need for Black community to have ready access to banking financial institutions. So I don't want to hear. So Jeff, I think everyone can see the chat. So rather than me read it, I don't know if Jeff, if you want to address some of it. How do we build community? How do we build community and inclusivity?
That's such a fantastic question.
And specifically, they're referencing a time where this is at a BLM event where it was expressed that, well, right, if Asians are controlling so many things like small business loans and the Black community does not have ready access to it, how do we build community when these kinds of statements are encouraged or people were clapping when it was resonating with them? I think that's a great question. And it really has to do with, well, community and divide and conquer, right? There's a reason why both things work, but both are, it always feels like it's a greater struggle to build the positive thing rather than to divide or to demonize, right? But what I would say is, I think if we're being honest, we can see a certain distrust between communities that goes both ways. I think it's spread by ourselves and also by media because of a certain kind of story, right? And so for myself personally, say, whether you're in a room, whatever, there are experiences where you go, okay, if there are other people of color or African-American people, to some extent, they want to know where you stand. Because again, if we're perceived as the in-between people, then where are we really when push comes to shove? I think that's a question. I think that with what the history of African Americans in this country has gone through, there's a reason for that intense distrust of many, many different things. It then becomes incumbent on all of us, however we choose or have the tools to do, to see, well, how are we allies to each other? How do we improve in how we do that? And also, how do we educate both ourselves and others potentially in our community, right? One of the great denial narratives is, well, yes, America's had these racial problems, but they are a thing of the past, right? That's something many people like to believe. That's blatantly untrue. I hope that's proven. But for instance, it was only pandemic time where I learned more about the details of things like redlining, for instance, right? The real estate discrimination, which I think is linked to these loan issues as well, is if you're locked out of that kind of economic power in this country, right, it hugely gets in the way of whether you're able to pursue the American dream in the same way, right? And yes, Asian Americans have faced certain similar discriminations. That's the funny thing. I know people whose, you know, parents or parents' parents were, it was made very clear, you know what, you don't want to be buying a house in this neighborhood. But that has also faded, I think, much faster in many, many areas for Asian Americans than our Black counterparts. So given that that's, if we accept that as true, then it does partly fall on us both to educate ourselves and others in the community to try and set that context of why there's distrust and, well, what can we do about it? What do we want to do about it? I don't know that that's a great answer to the person who posted, but I appreciate the question. One way is that narratively, something I'm very strongly feel about, and what Tom has always done sort of automatically, is intersectionality within narrative, right? Within reality, but also within narrative, is share a story together, share a stage together, where we're in the story together with three-dimensionality, with conflict, with whatever it is, but show it, capture those things, you know, because remember, that's a lot of lost history as well. Frederick Douglass spoke against the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Who knew that? Where's that story? And then you look at events like, Capitol riot, but next day was the Senate elections in Georgia, the runoffs, right? And that election was a multi-racial coalition organized partly by Ms. Abrams and company, right? So that's, in a way, that's a model. How do we do it in narrative? How do we do it in life? And the answer is people have been doing it, but do we know about it? And what do we learn from their models?
You know, one thing that with Artists at Play, you know, we started and we were there because we wanted to provide opportunities for Asian American artists and tell our stories. But over the last 10 years, we've realized that a lot of our work is not necessarily only to be seen by Asian Americans. We've come to really see that our work is important to be seen by other communities, because it's when other communities see our stories that they understand the humanity, right, and the struggles and the history of the Asian American community. And that then needs to go both ways. We as individuals, we as artists, we as consumers, we can't just focus on seeing ourselves and the importance of seeing ourselves in media. It's we need to advocate for and see and learn about the struggles of other communities. And that's not just like among racial communities. You know, we're talking about learning about disabled communities, learning about LGBT, because it's only through that sharing of experiences and us actively searching for those stories that we can learn better empathy, more, and learn about the humanity of other people. So that then that is also what we feel brings and builds that intersectionality, that understanding of communities working together in order to move forward for social justice, anti-racism, anti-bias. That is something I think that we can all do on an individual level, whether it's yourself, youth that are in your life, children that are in your life. You know, you don't even have to just be a parent or a teacher. If there is a kid in your life that you love, encourage them to learn about and see communities outside of themselves, because that's only how we're going to build new generations that are empathetic and know how to call out bullshit when they see it, right? So I think that's the other thing that we all need to do as individuals and as a community. So I have
a lot going on in the chat.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to keep up with it.
Yeah. No, that question from Anju really just brought up so much. You know, for me, it's seeing images of these intersecting communities, like showing those human stories. You know, like in Chinese Massacre, there's a scene where Biddy Mason is helping Yut Ho and what's the other guy's name? Lee Tong. You know, it's such a beautiful, heartwarming scene, and we don't see enough of that. Um, so as artists, it's putting those images in the forefront and showing no, it's not just headlines that we read in the news that kind of foment this distrust. Um, and I love how at the end of the play, Tom brings together the images of the race riots in Los Angeles, right? So seeing how all these communities have been affected by a mob mentality, right? Um, so yeah, um, I actually had a very hard time during the pandemic in regards to Anju's initial question. So for me personally, like all I could do at that time was to just educate myself, right? And find those I guess like alliances between our two communities. You know, learning more about Yuri Kochiyama and the activists, you know, with Malcolm X, and like learning about those alliances that help to strengthen um, the history of these two communities. Yeah.
So you, Julie, did portray that history in Mexican Day. The of the three plays in the Bimini Baz trilogy, that was the only one that the LA Times liked. And the reason that they liked it was the idea of people from different backgrounds coming together to do what was right and to make the world a better place. So I, I, I feel like everything I write helps propel me into the next thing. And so things I learned in working on Chinese Massacre then really helped me in the whole Bimini Baths trilogy, not just in the style of the plays, but also what might be a next step towards solutions to some of these problems. And we did see a step toward that in 1948.
I just want to call out, a lot of you don't know this play Mexican Day, but again, Tom wrote this play where there's four characters. They are white, Latinx, Asian, and Black, and they are really roughly equal in the play. I would say they are an ensemble, and they all have a story. And then even in the room, see, that changes what's in the room, right? Of how we're interacting. In a way, making theater or making art itself is an attempt or exercise in community. But one thing is we were talking about, okay, so how many plays have we seen in LA that have that particular makeup, where it's that equal in terms of everyone having something to do? And that's a tribute, I think, to both Tom's imagination and his commitment, whether conscious or not, about, you know what, he's not afraid to attempt these really three-dimensional roles for actors of color that in fact have to be played by actors of color if you're going to tell this particular LA story.
So,
right?
So Jeff, there was something really, then thank you for thinking of that, but there's something very deliberate in the whole trilogy. There are no actual actors of color in the first play in 1916, and in the second play, there are no Asian American characters. There's one
and
Black
no
character.
women.
And no women, and no women. Yes, and there are no women until the third play. So there was, you know, as the world kind of got a little better, the plays got a little bit more representative too, on purpose.
So many layers, Tom. It's just mind-blowing.
We're running short on time. I know there's one more question in the chat, but unfortunately I won't be able to get to that. I have one more question, and then we're going to just, everyone gets a chance to plug what you're working, because we're all artists, we've all got something going on. So Tom, Jeff, and Julie, go ahead, plug something that you're working on right now.
I am working on yet another LA play. I've been writing a lot of plays that kind of tie Los Angeles to Germany, especially between the wars. And so this is a true story of how Leni Riefenstahl came to Hollywood to get distribution for her film Olympia in 1938. Her timing was shitty. She arrived in New York on November 4th, and on November 9th, Kristallnacht happened. She had a bunch of appointments in Hollywood on November 4th, and by the time she got to Hollywood, she had one appointment with Walt Disney. And so this is the two-hander about that meeting.
Wow.
That's cool. Jeff, go ahead.
Me? Okay, I'm working on a new TYA musical of all things. It's
That's
called
amazing.
Poop, the musical. And it's a stealth Asian American political play because it's about a little Asian boy who has an accident on the bus and he's mortified. Everyone wants to go back to school again. He's in his room, he's sad, he's crying, he won't talk to his mom, but his favorite stuffed animals, as well as the poop emoji, appear to him and take him on this journey to the historical England of Thomas Crapper, the inventor of the toilet, and also to rural India and rural China, where he learns things like shame about poop actually is obscuring things like lack of proper global sanitation is life and death for millions of people still in the world. And for instance, there's a World Toilet Day of activism. And so by the end, he's sort of gotten out of himself a little and he's ready to go back to school. And he's even a little bit of an activist. So we're workshopping that. Hopefully it'll premiere at the Adventure Theater in Washington, DC next year. And there's a rap, there's a power ballad, there's a boy band song. So it's very cross genre. And the Philip Chung wrote the script, and the music is by Woody Pack, who wrote the music for Making Tracks, and I believe the musical adaptation of The Wedding Banquet, if you're familiar at all.
Oh, cool. Cool. Julie?
Yeah, I have an improv show coming up November 18th with Improv Theater and Cold Tofu Improv. It's called Script Tease. And actually, Tom, I might hit you up in the upcoming months. The format is we get the first 2 pages of a never before read play from a local playwright. We cold read it with the cast and the audience. It's share screened on through Zoom. And after the first 2 pages, the cast continues with the rest of the play and we find out where it goes. That's November 18th. Information on that is on coldtofu.com and also my personal website, julielee.com.
Who's the 2 playwrights for the script tease? Do you know?
Yes, 2 playwrights from Company of Angels, Tamader Alakil and Judy Suhu, who's a long-time Asian American playwright from Lodestone Theater days. Yeah, so those 2 playwrights are being featured next month.
That's amazing. Script tease is so much fun to watch. I really love it. Artists at Play, real quick. Artists at Play in celebration of Filipino American History Month, we're re-releasing a previously recorded performance of Alos, the story of Carlos Bulasan. It is a theater for young audiences performance, and we have lots of great additional material to support that play reading. We're going to release it this coming Monday. It's available to view on YouTube, and it'll be for 2 weeks. So it's Alos, the story of Carlos Bulasan, written by Giovanni Ortega and directed by Fran De Leon. And it's in celebration of Filipino American History Month. And we're done. Michael, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Can I say one last thing, please?
Go, Jeff.
Can I say one last thing? I just want to, for all of us who got to work on this, I want to thank Artists at Play so much, but also Cam, because all the stuff I was saying before, museums and the alliance between those kinds of institutions and artists and storytellers, I think can be part of that sort of larger movement we're talking about. And because of Cam and AAP, I got to reconnect with these people, with Tom and all that. So I just want to express our gratefulness to that, and also to recognize all that we've gotten from museums and like institutions for all our lives. I know that's true of me, while Tom is super active in that community. So I just want to throw that out there before we say.
Thank you so much for that, Jeff. And thank you, Stephanie, Julie, and Tom, for the deep conversations about how the arts can be used as an inspiring method to really enrich our stories and to help us really create an opportunity for representation. A lot of the conversation today was really about how we present ourselves and how people can not just be a space where people are able to see who we are, but also understand who we are. What I can really learn working through this program was really the fact that, when we talked about the massacre, and what happened to a community, is the people outside the community that really came up to us, was asking us how can they support our efforts in the commemoration, and they lean on us to make sure that we are able to provide that history that's really accurate and is important to our own community. So we really appreciate this opportunity for Artists at Play to really provide a new and different opportunity to really share this history. With that said, I'm really excited to continue this partnership with Artists at Play and with all of you, because we really realize how important the arts are to our community and how the performing arts provide a creative way for people to really experience and understand our own history. Thank you. Tomorrow concludes our 8 days of programming. Join us virtually at 5 p.m. for an annual commemoration ceremony where we recognize the lives lost in the Chinese Massacre by the reading of the names. Also like to let you know that the Chinese American Museum recently reopened to the public and is open on Fridays to Sunday at 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. I encourage all of you to visit the museum to learn more about the Chinese American history and explore our newest exhibition, Collective Resilience, Asian American Artists Honoring Such Community, Strength, and Unity. Stephanie, I'd like to pass over to you to see if you have any closeout thoughts.
No, we don't. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Thank you, CAM, for this partnership and for supporting the reading of the Chinese Massacre annotated. We've had a wonderful year and a half working with the Chinese American Museum, and that's kind of the funny thing about the pandemic is we've had wonderful collaborations with organizations that we wouldn't have expected to be able to have. And the Chinese American Museum is definitely at the top of that list. So please make sure you support Chinese American Museum, Artists at Play, and all of your arts organizations throughout Los Angeles County. We all need your support to continue the work that we do. So thank you again, everyone, for being here today.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.